All right. Hello, everyone. This should be the first live stream for Wikilection, assuming this is working, which it looks like it is. Switch views here. So thank you for joining me. Please bear with me as I figure out how to use this application for the first time doing an actual live stream. As the slide here suggests, today's topic is evidence and how it's going to be used within Wikilection. Because this is the first live stream, I figure it might help to go through what the goals here are and sort of what the plans for the live streams are long-term, just so you have a bit of context. This is the first one. The goal of these live streams, first and foremost, is to provide information about Wikilection to people who are interested. Based on the feedback that we get, it'll then be used to improve the design and then refine both the plans and the actual explanation of how to get the idea of Wikilection across to everyone. The general idea is there's going to be a few different topics, and we'll cycle through them over different weeks. So today's topic is evidence, the idea being that first we present the topic in the current state, based on the session itself and the questions we get while we're live, plus any feedback that we get after the fact. That'll all be incorporated into improving the design and getting a better idea of where things are going. And then after we have the topic updated, sorry, I was trying to move forward there. After it's updated, we'll cover the topic again in a couple of weeks with the new sort of any changes, any new explanation, that type of thing. Some example topics are, of course, evidence that we're covering today, as well as politician history and controversial science topics, that type of thing. So on to today's topic, actually using evidence to fight misinformation. In this context, evidence is referring to anything that we can use to prove something is true. So as we hear information either in the news or things, scientific claims being made, if we actually want to prove if something is true or not, what type of evidence would we look at? And that's the type of evidence that we're talking about here. Now I will be switching back and forth between the presentation and the back end here. Hopefully that won't be too disruptive. I'm not even sure you can see that. Just to see if any questions are coming in. Not seeing anything yet. Good. So going to the next page. The first thing that we'll really talk about in depth is the existing model. And by that, I mean how information is relayed to the public and sort of where evidence fits in that model. So this very basic diagram shows how information might be presented to the public. That's on the outside. And you can see here that we've highlighted channel. Channel is sort of a broad term for a combination of any organizations involved, like news agencies, that might help sort of tell different stories and provide that type of content. But that can also be simpler things like a YouTube channel. So a channel, as it says here, is anything that produces content to provide important or interesting information to the public. So the obvious examples are going to be things like national TV news, any local radio, specifically radio news, and then again, YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, that type of thing. Commonly, those will have a specific purpose, like talking about science or politics or things like that. Now, the challenges here is this what we call selective omission. And so that means them not talking about certain things. There might be valid reasons for doing that, like it's just not interesting enough, or it's outside of their area of expertise, like a science channel probably won't talk about politics too much. There's sensationalizing, so taking things that maybe aren't newsworthy and making them sound newsworthy and important, more just to drive traffic and sort of generate income for the channel. And a part of what a channel is supposed to do, as we'll talk about in the next slide, is to get a collection of experts to talk about the evidence in question. And if they are not good at selecting experts, or they're good at selecting experts that maybe just tell their side of the story, that's another challenge that we can see when we're dealing with the various types of channels and content available. Next, we're looking at the experts. So these are the individuals that sort of explain and help discuss these complex topics. They're assumed to have some level of expertise. The examples that we have listed here, they're scientists, politicians, economists, and journalists. Typically within a channel, you'll have at least some sort of, a journalist or somebody controlling how the story is told and what story is told. There is some amount of expertise there and just making sure they've properly validated the information that they're showing. And everything else is, I imagine, fairly straightforward, where a scientist might be brought on to talk about a new scientific discovery or some sort of a scientific study. And again, you're assuming that they're qualified to talk about what they're talking about. The challenges with this model in having experts sort of explain that complex content or that complex information to the public, you get the ability, of course, for them to have biased reporting, which can be fairly related to the next item, conflict of interest. So this might be if somebody comes from a certain industry where they're performing a role. So let's say, for example, somebody who's a scientist in the petrochemical industry, they would be assumed to have a fair amount of knowledge in that area, but it might also present a conflict of interest if they're reporting on something that might damage their industry. And then you also have the challenge of we don't necessarily know with how a lot of the experts are presented to us, what sort of skills this person has, how talented are they in the area where we're told that they're an expert. So we don't know, how skilled this person is compared to some of the other experts that might be reporting on the same thing, that might be in agreement, or it actually may conflict with what they're saying. So who would you trust in that case? And then finally, we're looking at the evidence itself. So this is the type of information that we would use to determine if something is true. That generally involves some sort of an expertise to correctly verify and know if the evidence that you're looking at is legitimate or not. Examples here are some sort of a scientific report, any legislation, court records, that type of thing. And then the challenges there include, of course, verifying to make sure that it's real, that it's accurate, that it's gone through the proper checks and balances for that industry. So for something like a scientific report, well, what does a properly designed scientific study look like? And where can things go wrong? When the evidence is being cited within the channels by experts, you can have a study that's well designed and everyone agrees is worth using, but you can misrepresent it. That's another thing that as the public, when we're seeing content through these sort of channels or through these filters, that's something that we have to, I guess, choose to trust. And then finally, is there similar evidence talking about the same claim or talking about the same topic? And does the evidence that we're being presented, does that agree with all the other evidence available? Or is it an outlier and 9 out of 10 pieces of evidence on this topic actually disagree with the outcome? That sort of thing. So next we'll talk about, based on the 3 levels that we talked about and the challenges presented, what are some possible solutions and how can Wikilection in particular use this evidence to help fight misinformation? So in this case, we'll actually, before I move on, let me check for any comments. There are none, all right. So if we're going through the reverse order here, where let me just talk a bit in depth about this image here. Whoops, I'm gonna go back. On the left is the typical model. So that's where you're looking at sort of a pool of evidence that most people don't really even know how to access it. And if they do, might not understand all of it. That proof is then sort of taken and understood by experts to figure out what's worth talking about. They would, do their due diligence, make sure that what they're saying is true. They would then take that story and sort of present it as going through the channel. And then the channel is going to have its own filters. Is it interesting enough? Did we get the right people involved? That type of thing. So when we're talking about possible ways to improve how evidence is handled, one is to have a larger group review the evidence itself. In general, this should be people that are have some amount of expertise in that area. That's not to say that if you're reviewing a scientific report, you have to have a certain, degree in science. If you've proven yourself knowledgeable in a certain area, that might be enough. The idea here is that the type of review is going to be tailored to the specific kind of evidence. So you wouldn't use the same steps to validate, let's say, a scientific report than you would to validate, let's say, some legislation or a source used by a journalist. Next is the actual sort of organizations and people involved with creating that evidence. Now, this is different from like the news agencies and journalists and producers and so on involved with telling the story to the public. This is about, if we're talking about a scientific study, who are the people who actually conducted the scientific study and which organizations paid for it and were sort of behind the scenes. The idea here is that we can make sure that the people are qualified. We'll go into experts a bit more. The same rules will apply there, where we want to know more about the people who were involved in creating it. And a key here is to spot any conflicts of interest. So if we're seeing, that there's not a lot of evidence available and all of it is made by a person or a company that maybe has some conflicts of interests and maybe some bias, that might be an area where more evidence is needed. And then finally, as we talked about in the previous slide, what does the similar evidence say? So the idea is that each piece of evidence is reviewed by itself, but then it's also grouped together with other similar pieces of evidence so that you can see what evidence is available for a certain claim. Hopefully there's multiple pieces of evidence supporting it, and you can see where it agrees and where it conflicts with other evidence available. Now, when it comes to the experts, first, we need to be able to track the experts. And by that, I just mean track who is making these claims so that we can say, we can review that, which we'll get to in a second. And this is all the different experts involved. So if we're talking about the experts, that might actually be the scientists or legal analysts or economists, whoever is involved in actually really understanding that content. But that also means any journalists or people involved in both deciding what stories to tell and to sort of help relate that and possibly even translate some of the more complex stuff from experts to the public. Now, for each of the claims made by an expert, again, we want to track those as well. And this is so that we can verify them, but also so that over time, we can have a catalog of the claims made by each expert and ideally how accurate those claims were. So over time, if somebody's made 100 claims, you can get an idea of how accurate their claims tend to be and across which topics. So somebody might be really good at talking about science, but maybe when it gets into, how that's actually applied into legislation or in the areas where it's not specifically in their area of expertise, maybe of course their claims drop off in accuracy. It's good to know where someone is actually skilled. And then finally, the industry that expert is a part of. So let's say if they're a scientist and they're being brought on to discuss a certain piece of evidence, how does that expert's summary compare to the other people in that role? So if you bring on a scientist to understand a certain report, what are other scientists saying about that report as well? So that you know how this claim compares to the rest of the people in that industry or in that role. And then tied together with the expert claims above, the goal is to see not just what the expert says and what their industry says, but the people who are saying certain things, how often are they accurate? So if the people who are the most accurate all sort of lean a certain way, that might be a good sign that that's actually where the truth lies. And then finally, what can we do about channels? So first, the idea here is this kind of replaces the concept of a channel or a media outlet, where instead of it going to a certain TV news channel or a certain YouTube channel, the goal here is that we have a big collection of evidence that's been reviewed, of experts that have reviewed that information and sort of grouped together in different themes, like around a certain story, maybe all the evidence that supports that story or that claim and the experts involved. And we start to see how that shows over time, so that it's not about cherry picking experts that agree with a certain point. You're seeing it overall, and you can start to see where the truth lies across not just the filtered view available through the sort of channel deciding what gets published model you see on the left. Instead, everyone can see for themselves where the evidence is leading. And there is going to be a lot of information out there. There is a purpose behind the channels filtering out some stories because they might just not be interesting or important. The idea here is that people can do that themselves. So when the community is grouping and filtering and voting, they're also choosing different topics and where a certain piece of information might be grouped. And then the individual people using Wikilection can view the stories and view the information based on what they value and what they're interested in. Now, we'll also track the channels themselves. And that means like the individual news channels and YouTube channels, and people also making claims through the content that they create. It's a little bit similar to how we track and review evidence, but in this case, the content isn't something you probably cite or something that you would reference in your own work. Generally speaking, if you were trying to really find out the truth about, let's say, some new scientific information, you would want to reference the actual documents, not some sort of a news story about those documents. But we still want to track it, similar to the other areas, so that we can track the channels that are responsible for discussing these various pieces of content, these topics, and spot trends and see if they're skewed a certain way, possibly track what kind of biases they have, that type of thing. And then also the experts involved in that content created. So this all sort of ties together where people have access to the experts' explanations of the evidence that's available without needing to really thoroughly understand the evidence itself. I'm going to jump back to the presentation here. No comments, good. So all this comes together with evidence being at the center of the different modules that we'll talk about within Wikilection in future videos. So you can see here, evidence is in the middle, and it's sort of acting as the core for these three modules and anything else that comes out in the future. This is really one of the main pieces. This is all about what can you prove, what information is available, and it's not about what you can say in a convincing way and skew things towards your topic by just cherry picking certain pieces of information. So we talked about the evidence core. We probably don't need to go too deep on that. But the idea here is that you've got your participants. That's people like politicians, where we'll have a special history for them with their history as politicians. And then as well, any media figures and experts that are brought out to explain certain topics, we'll have information on them as well. And the kinds of information that we would see sort of supporting information on these participants would be things like, clips from news shows and newspapers, posts that they've actually made on social media. And especially when we get into politicians, the government data available on how they did their job, like where they spent money and where they got their money from, that type of thing. For the topic summary, this is where we take the information available on certain topics. So let's say controversial things like vaccines and climate change. And the idea is to get a snapshot of what we can see based on the information or based on the evidence that has been reviewed, the ability to sort of group those together and figure out what claims made by the different sides of the argument can be backed up by the evidence available. And the types of evidence that would support that are going to be, as you see here, scientific studies, economic reports, legislation, that type of thing. So the sort of thing that will actually affect the larger ideas and actually sort of how you discuss complex and controversial topics. And then finally, which is kind of one of the core things and where the name Wikilection really came from, is an election overview. So when people go to vote in an election, the ability to give them a really good summary of the options available. So this means the candidate's competing for a certain role. It can take information from the participants area and get a really good snapshot of that person's history that follows them throughout time. So you can see claims they've made, you can see what they've done with previous election promises, that type of thing, where their money came from. And then as well for ballot measures, like, Proposition 1, 2, 3, you can then use topic summary to get, well, a summary of what the evidence and the experts say is going on with that topic. And the types of content specific to elections are going to be the things like a video of a campaign speech, or a speech made at a rally, that kind of thing. Any campaign or like campaign platform flyers, and then also the data on where their fundraising came from, who funded their campaign. And with all of this in all three areas, as I said before, everything is based on evidence. So when you see something about a person on the election, or you see something about a certain person in their history as a politician or an expert, or you see information summarized based on a controversial topic, you can dive as deep as you want and take a look at the actual evidence to see what led the community to lean one way or the other and summarize things as it currently is. So that's just a quick overview of when we're talking about evidence in terms of Wikilection, what that means. If you'd like to learn more, we have a website, www.wikilection.com. And as well, you can go to facebook.com/Wikilection or patreon.com/Wikilection. That's the two areas where we are the most active. In the future, we'll also have Twitter accounts and stuff like that, but these are the three channels that see the most information right now. And let me check for comments one more time. Doesn't look like anything is there. That is everything that I wanted to cover today. We'll figure out what the topic is for next week. There's a decent chance it'll probably be politician history. That was the second example, and it's kind of one of the core modules that a lot of people seem to like the sound of. So if there are no comments or anything, we will call it a day, and I will see you next week. Thanks.